Silas Thornfield didn't know he was about to sign his own death warrant. He just knew he heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, which was a constant companion out here on the prairie. It wasn't the rustle of a rabbit or the call of a hawk. It was a human sound, a low moan of pain that cut through the morning stillness and sent a jolt of ice straight through his heart. His hand, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor and a war he tried every day to forget, went straight to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. That was instinct. Survival. Out here, 40 miles from the nearest spit of a town called Cedar Ridge, a human sound was almost always bad news. It meant soldiers, or outlaws, or worse. Silas froze, his body going perfectly still, a trick he'd learned in the forests of Virginia, where a snapped twig could get you killed. He listened. His eyes scanned the thick willow brush along the creek bed. The sound came again, weaker this time, fainter, like a candle flame sputtering in the wind. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get on his horse, ride back to his cabin, and bolt the door. Forget he ever heard it. A man alone didn't last long by getting involved in other people's trouble. He had built this life of solitude for a reason, to keep the world and its ugliness at a distance. But then, another sound came. Not from the brush, but from inside his own head. A memory. The face of a boy, no older than 16, lying in a ditch outside Richmond, wearing the wrong color uniform, crying for his mother as his life soaked into the mud. Silas had been ordered to keep moving then. He'd had no choice. He had left the boy to die alone. And he'd been paying for it ever since. He couldn't leave another soul to die alone in a ditch. He just couldn't. Cursing himself, his compassion, and the ghost of that long-dead boy, Silas moved toward the sound. He parted the willow branches, his boots silent on the damp earth. And what he saw crumpled against the creek bank would not only change his life, it would set the entire territory on a path to war. She was an Apache woman, young, maybe 20, and broken like a doll. Her buckskin dress was torn and stained with blood that had dried to the color of rust. Her long black hair was a tangled mess of mud and leaves. An arrow shaft, snapped off near the fletching, jutted from her left shoulder. A deep gash on her thigh was crudely wrapped with a strip of her own dress, but the cloth was soaked crimson. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, each gasp a tiny, losing battle for life. For a moment, Silas just stared. The war had taught him to hate the sight of an Apache. They were the enemy, the reason settlers bolted their doors at night and slept with rifles by their beds. Helping her was not just foolish, it was an act of treason in the eyes of his own people. They'd call him an Indian lover. The militia would probably hang him for it. And her own people? They were even worse. If they found him with one of their women, they wouldn't wait for a rope. They'd take him apart, piece by piece. But as he looked at her face, even pale and etched with pain, he saw a startling beauty. High cheekbones, proud features. This was no ordinary woman. There was a nobility to her, a strength that even unconsciousness couldn't hide. He knelt beside her, his mind a whirlwind of risk and consequence. Then, her eyes fluttered open. Just for a second. Dark, deep eyes that locked onto his. In that single, fleeting moment, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a person. Frightened. Hurting. Pleading for help without saying a word. The decision made itself. Logic and self-preservation were washed away by a simple, powerful wave of humanity. To hell with the militia. To hell with the warriors. He wasn't going to let her die. He gently scooped her into his arms, surprised at how light she was. As he stood up, his boots scuffed the dirt where she had been lying. A small object, half buried in the mud, caught the morning sun. It wasn't a bead or a piece of leather. It was metal. A brass button, dented and grimy, with an eagle stamped on it. A U.S. cavalry button. Now what in the world was that doing way out here? The journey back to his ranch was a special kind of hell. The sun beat down, turning the prairie into a furnace. The woman in his arms was a dead weight, and with every step, the ache in his back grew into a roaring fire. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. He had to stop every 100 yards or so, laying her gently in the shade of a lone cottonwood while he gasped for breath, his lungs burning. During these breaks, he studied her. The fever was getting worse. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She'd murmur in her own language, words he couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear from the pain in her voice. Delirium was setting in. He found the cavalry button in a small leather pouch tied to her belt. He rolled it over in his palm. It didn't make any sense. Why would an Apache woman, shot with an arrow, be carrying a soldier's button? Had she been attacked by soldiers? No, the arrow was Apache-made. He was sure of it. Had she stolen it? Maybe. Or maybe it was a trophy from a raid. The possibilities churned in his gut, each one more unsettling than the last. This wasn't just a woman in trouble. This was a mystery, wrapped in a threat. By the time he saw the familiar shape of his small cabin on the horizon, the sky was bleeding orange and purple. He carried her inside and laid her on his own bed, the only soft thing he owned. The cabin was stark, just 2 rooms built with his own hands. It was a reflection of his life, simple, isolated, and fortified against the world. But now, the world had come crashing through his door. Her condition was bad. Really bad. Her breathing was a ragged, shallow whisper. The fever was raging. He knew if he didn't do something, she wouldn't last the night. He had no real medical training, just the brutal lessons of the battlefield. He started by cutting away the torn buckskin. Her body was a roadmap of violence. Bruises, cuts, scrapes. The arrow in her shoulder was lodged deep in the muscle. Getting it out was beyond him, but he cleaned the wound as best he could. The gash on her thigh was the most urgent problem. It was deep, still oozing blood. It needed stitches. He sterilized a needle and thread in the flame of his lamp, took a long pull of whiskey for his own nerves, and went to work. She moaned and writhed as he stitched the wound closed, her unconscious mind screaming at the pain. The sounds tore at him, but he kept his hands steady. He cleaned every cut, applied a poultice of herbs to the arrow wound, and bandaged everything with strips torn from his own clean shirts. As night fell, he settled into his rocking chair beside the bed, his rifle across his lap. The familiar comfort of his isolation was gone, replaced by a suffocating dread. Every creak of the cabin walls, every howl of a distant coyote, made his heart hammer against his ribs. He was listening for the one sound he feared most, the thunder of approaching horses. The night stretched on, an eternity of waiting and watching. Her fever climbed. Her body began to shake violently, convulsing under the blankets. She started talking, a frantic torrent of Apache words. Her hands thrashed, clawing at unseen enemies. Tears streamed from her closed eyes as she relived whatever horror had left her by the creek. Then, through the delirium, she spoke in English. Her voice was a cracked whisper, but the words were clear, and they chilled Silas to the bone. "Father," she gasped, her face turned toward him, though her eyes were still shut tight. "They come for me. Must hide. They come." Silas leaned forward. Who was coming? Her people. "Many horses," she choked out, her voice gaining a strange strength. "Paint for war. Father angry. So angry." Her hands clenched into fists. "Blood on the ground," she sobbed. "Too much blood." Her words painted a terrifying picture, a war party, an angry father, a lot of blood. He felt a knot of pure fear tighten in his stomach. He had invited this into his home. He had carried it across his threshold. Just as he was trying to make sense of her fevered warnings, he looked out the small cabin window, past the reflection of his own worried face. And he saw it. Far in the distance, under the pale light of the rising moon, a single thin column of smoke was rising into the night sky. A signal. And then another appeared beside it. And then a third. They were coming. And they were close. The smoke signals were gone by morning, but the sense of dread they left behind was thicker than fog. Silas had dozed off in his chair, a fitful, dream-haunted sleep. When he woke, the sun was streaming through the window, and a pair of dark eyes were watching him. She was awake. The fever had broken, and the delirium was gone. In its place was a sharp, calculating intelligence. She was studying him, her gaze taking in his worn clothes, the simple cabin, the rifle still resting on his lap. She was sizing him up. the way a wolf sizes up a stray dog. "You are the one who brought me here," she said. Her English was perfect, just a slight musical accent. Her voice was quiet, but held an unmistakable authority. "You were dying by the creek," Silas replied, his own voice hoarse. Seemed like the decent thing to do. She held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face for something. Deception, maybe. Or weakness. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because the corner of her mouth lifted in a faint, tired smile. "My name is Ayanna," she said. "It means eternal blossom. What do they call you, white man who shows mercy to his enemies?" "Silas Thornfield. And I don't know that we're enemies. You needed help, that's all." The smile deepened, and for a second, he saw the stunning beauty he'd glimpsed by the creek. "You speak like a man who has seen too much war." Then her expression hardened. "The arrow can wait. There are more pressing concerns. When did you find me?" "2 days ago, in the morning. You've been out of it since then." The color drained from her face. She struggled to sit up, wincing in pain. "2 days," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Then he knows I'm gone. My father. He will be searching." "Your father?" Silas asked, though a cold part of him already knew the answer. "Chief Mutton," she said. The name hit Silas like a punch to the gut. Chief Mutton, the most feared and respected Apache war chief in the territory. A man whose name was a legend, whispered in hushed, fearful tones by settlers and soldiers alike. A man said to lead 300 warriors who would follow him into the mouth of a cannon. "His patience with the whites was gone long before I fled," she said, her eyes dark with a terrible knowledge. "The cavalry burned our winter camp last spring. Women and children died." Silas felt the floor drop out from under him. He wasn't just hiding an injured Apache woman. He was sheltering the daughter of a living legend, a man whose grief had turned to a burning, all-consuming rage. "If he thinks a white man has harmed me," Ayanna continued, her voice low and steady, "he will not rest until this entire valley runs red with blood. He will burn every ranch, every homestead, every trace of your people from here to the Arkansas River." As if summoned by her words, a new sound reached them. It started as a low rumble, a vibration in the floorboards. It grew steadily, a deep, rhythmic thunder that wasn't thunder at all. It was the sound of horses, hundreds of them, coming fast. Silas rushed to the window. The northern horizon was choked with a massive cloud of dust. It wasn't a search party. It was an army. And then, riding on the wind, came the sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. The high, ululating war cries of an Apache war party on the attack. "They come," Ayanna said quietly from the bed. She had managed to push herself up, her back straight, her chin high. The look on her face was a mixture of pride and terror. "The choice is no longer yours to make, Silas Thornfield," she said, her voice filled with a grim finality. "The choice now belongs to my father." The thunder of hooves grew to a deafening roar, and then a new sound cut through it all. A single, powerful voice barking a command in Apache. Instantly, the war cries stopped. The thundering gallop slowed. An eerie, heavy silence fell over the ranch, a silence more terrifying than all the noise before it. Silas knew, with a certainty that turned his blood to ice, that Chief Matan wasn't just with them. He was leading them. The great chief had come himself. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Silas could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on his small cabin, could feel the weight of their hatred pressing in on him. He checked the load in his rifle, a futile gesture. He was one man against an army. His life was now measured in minutes. The first warriors appeared on the ridge to the east, their silhouettes dark against the morning sun. Then more to the west. Soon, every rise of land surrounding his small valley was lined with them. Painted faces, rifles, lances. They sat on their horses, perfectly still, a silent, deadly promise of violence. "There is something you should know," Ayanna said urgently from the bed. Her voice was a strained whisper. "Something that will decide whether you live or die." He turned from the window to face her. Her eyes were wide, filled with a desperate intensity. He saw fear there, but also a fierce resolve. "Why I was by the creek," she said. "Why I was alone. It's not what you think." But before she could say more, the sound of a single horse broke the stillness. A slow, deliberate walk. One rider approaching the cabin. Not with the fury of an attack, but with the cold, unshakable confidence of a king approaching a peasant's hut. Silas looked out the window again. The rider was older, his hair streaked with gray. Feathers were woven into his braids, and his face was a mask of granite, weathered by sun and war. Even from a distance, the sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. It was him, Chief Matan. He stopped his horse 20 yards from the porch and simply sat there, his dark eyes fixed on the cabin door. The silence became a physical thing, a weight that made it hard to breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low growl, but it carried across the yard with the power of a landslide. "White man," he called out, his English thick with an accent but clear as a bell. "You have something that belongs to me. How you have treated her will determine if your death is quick or if it is very, very slow." This was it, the moment of truth. Silas put his hand on the door latch, his palms sweating. But Ayana's voice, sharp and commanding, stopped him. "Wait! Before you go out there, you must listen." Silas paused, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Outside, the most dangerous man in the territory waited for an answer. Inside, the woman whose life he had saved was about to tell him a secret that would change everything. 3 days ago, Ayana began, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Soldiers came to our village. They carried a white flag. They spoke of peace." She pushed herself up further, her face contorted with pain and fury. "They brought gifts. Whiskey. They told my father of a great peace council. A meeting where all the chiefs would gather to sign a treaty that would end the fighting forever. They said the great white father in Washington himself had sent them." "Your father didn't believe them," Silas guessed, his mind racing. He was suspicious. But others on the council. They are tired of war. They urged him to listen. So I followed the soldiers when they left. Her eyes burned with the memory. I saw them meet with another, larger group of soldiers hidden in a canyon. I heard them talking, laughing. Her voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "It was a trap, Silas, a lie. They plan to gather all the chiefs, all the leaders in one place, and slaughter them all. Every man, woman, and child who comes for the peace council will die." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. This was bigger than a stolen daughter. This was a planned genocide. Ayana wasn't just a chief's daughter. She was a witness to a crime so monstrous it was almost unbelievable. And her father wasn't here because of him. He was here because his daughter, the only one who knew the truth, was missing, and the clock was ticking down to the annihilation of his people. "I tried to warn him," she said, tears of frustration and grief streaming down her face. "But by the time I got back, the soldiers were there, filling his ears with their poison words. I had no proof. They would have called me a hysterical girl. So I fled. I was trying to get to Cedar Ridge to find someone, anyone who might listen. But they found me. The soldiers. The arrow," Silas said, the pieces clicking into place. "It wasn't your people. No. One of their scouts was an Apache traitor. He shot me as I ran." Outside, Matan's voice boomed again, razor sharp with impatience. "I will not ask again, white man. Show yourself." Silas looked at Ayana. He saw the desperate hope in her eyes, the plea for him to make her father understand. The fate of hundreds, maybe thousands of lives now rested on his shoulders. Could he, a lone white rancher, convince a vengeful Apache chief of a truth so terrible? "If I tell him," Silas asked, his voice low, "will he believe me?" "He might," she whispered. "But the meeting is tomorrow, at sunrise. There is no time." Silas took a deep breath. He had stepped into a river, and the current was now pulling him toward a waterfall. Behind him was the woman who held the truth. In front of him was the man who held his life in his hands. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the dusty yard. Chief Matan sat on his horse, a statue of contained fury. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His face was a roadmap of old battles, and his eyes were like black stones, hard and ancient, and holding a universe of grief and rage. Behind him, the silent army of warriors watched, their hands resting on their weapons. The air was electric with tension. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this valley would become a slaughterhouse. "You have my daughter," Matan stated, his voice flat and dangerous. "Tell me why you still live." Silas held his hands up slowly, palms open, showing he was unarmed. "I found her by Willow Creek. She was wounded, dying. I brought her here. I tended her wounds." "Why?" The single word was laced with a century of suspicion and betrayal. Why would a white man help an Apache? "Because she was a human being in need of help," Silas said simply, holding the chief's gaze. "That's the only reason." Matan considered this, his expression unreadable. "You expect me to believe you acted from kindness? That you did not plan to use her as a hostage?" "I expect you to judge me by my actions," Silas replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Your daughter is inside. She is alive. She is safe. Go see for yourself." With a fluid, powerful movement, Matan swung himself off his horse. He strode toward the cabin, his presence so immense he seemed to shrink the world around him. Silas stepped aside, and the chief entered the small cabin. Silas could hear their voices from inside, a rapid, urgent exchange in Apache. He heard Ayana's voice, strained but firm. He heard Matan's voice, first sharp with questions, then softening with relief, then hardening again with a new, colder fury. After what felt like an eternity, Matan emerged. The look on his face was completely transformed. The personal rage was gone, replaced by the grim, focused intensity of a general on the eve of a battle he could not afford to lose. "My daughter tells me you have saved her life," he said, his voice now holding a note of grudging respect. "She also tells me why she was running. She has told me of the soldiers' treachery." "It's a trap," Silas confirmed. "A massacre disguised as a peace council." Matan's eyes blazed. "If what she says is true, then we are already late. Chiefs from 6 other bands are on their way to the meeting place. They walk into a field of guns. The 3 of them, the lone rancher, the chief's daughter, and the great war chief, stood there in the dust, an impossible alliance forged by desperation. Outside, an army waited, and somewhere, not far enough away, another army was preparing an ambush. History was holding its breath. "What do you need?" Silas asked. Matan looked at him, his eyes sharp. "You know this land, the white man's land. You know their forts, their trails. You can guide us. Help us find the soldiers' hidden camp before they can spring their trap." "There is more," Ayana said, appearing in the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame. "The officer in charge. He spoke of promotions, rewards from Washington. This is not just some rogue commander. The order comes from the top." The implication hung heavy in the air. They were not just fighting a troop of soldiers. They were fighting the entire United States government. "We ride now," Matan commanded. "My daughter will stay here. You will guard her." "No," Ayana said, her voice ringing with the same authority as her father's. "I go with you. I saw the officer's face. I heard his voice. I am the only one who can identify him." Matan started to argue in Apache, his voice a low rumble of protest, but Ayana cut him off, her words sharp and clear. Silas couldn't understand what they said, but he understood the battle of wills, and he was not surprised when Ayana won. "She rides," Matan announced, a reluctant pride in his voice. "But you," he said, turning to Silas, "you will ride beside me." Minutes later, the massive war party was in motion. Silas Thornfield, the man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, found himself riding at the head of an Apache army, next to its legendary chief, on a mission to stop a war by starting a battle. As they galloped away from the small, lonely ranch, Silas glanced back. It looked so peaceful, so insignificant. But it had become the unlikely epicenter of a conflict that would determine the fate of everyone, white and native, in the entire Colorado Territory. And it all started because he had chosen to listen to a cry for help. The war party moved like a living shadow across the prairie. They were a force of nature, 200 warriors flowing over the land with a silence and speed that was both beautiful and terrifying. Silas rode beside Chief Matan, a strange island of denim and leather in a sea of buckskin and war paint. Hours ago, these men had wanted his scalp. Now, they accepted his presence with a silent, disciplined acknowledgement. This was Matan's will, and his will was law. Ayanna rode a short distance behind them, surrounded by 4 of the chief's most elite warriors. She was pale and clearly in pain, but she sat her horse with a straight-backed defiance that shamed her injuries. Her eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, searching, hunting. As they rode, Matan spoke, his voice a low rumble against the sound of the hooves. He told Silas about the lies the soldiers had spun. Promises of food for starving children, medicine for the sick, land that would be theirs forever. "They offer us the future with one hand," Matan said, his voice thick with a bitter poison, "while they sharpen the knife behind their back with the other. It is the same story, repeated for 100 years. The land grew rougher, forcing them into rocky canyons and up steep winding trails. Here, Silas saw the true genius of the Apache warrior. They moved through the treacherous terrain as if it were an open field, their communication a complex language of hand signals and bird calls that were invisible to an untrained eye. These were not the savages of the newspapers. These were masters of their world, fighting a desperate battle for survival. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, Ayanna called out. They had reached a high plateau, and from here, they could see for miles. She was pointing to a distant valley, barely visible in the fading light. A thin haze of smoke rose from the valley floor, the smoke from dozens of cook fires. Silas lifted the spyglass Matan handed him. The view snapped into focus. Tents, arranged in perfect military rows. A large corral holding hundreds of horses, supply wagons, soldiers in blue uniforms moving about the camp. It was a full cavalry detachment. "There," Ayanna said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and rage. "That is the place. That is where I heard them plan our extinction." Matan took the spyglass, his knuckles white as he held it to his eye. He was silent for a long time, studying the camp, counting the men, assessing the position. The soldiers had chosen their spot well. The valley was a natural fortress, with clear fields of fire and steep rocky walls that would make a direct assault a nightmare. 200 soldiers, Matan finally said, lowering the glass. His face was grim. "Maybe more. They are well armed, well supplied, and they are expecting us." A cold reality settled over them. Matan's warriors were the best light cavalry in the world, but they were armed with a mix of old rifles, bows, and lances. The soldiers below had repeating carbines, and likely a Gatling gun or 2. To attack the camp directly would be a slaughter. They would be trading warrior for soldier, and it was a trade they could not afford to make. They would be walking into the very trap they were trying to stop. A heavy silence fell over the war council as the leaders gathered around Matan. The options were bleak. They could try to send riders to warn the other chiefs, but they would likely be intercepted. They could attack, but the cost would be catastrophic. It seemed hopeless. Then Silas spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the twilight. There might be another way. Every head turned to him. "Their commander," Silas said, looking from Matan to Ayanna. "You said he was ambitious, that he spoke of promotions. A man like that is driven by greed and ego." Matan nodded slowly. "What are you suggesting, Silas Thornfield?" "We don't attack the camp," Silas said, the audacious plan forming in his mind as he spoke. "We pull the snake's head from the hole. We bait him, lure him out." The plan he laid out was simple, reckless, and depended entirely on deception. Silas would ride down to the camp alone, under a white flag. He would claim to be a scout, a rancher who knew the territory and had vital information about Apache movements. He would offer to sell this information to the commander, information that would supposedly ensure the success of the Peace Council. He would insist on meeting the commander alone, away from the prying ears of his men, arguing that his information was too valuable to risk being overheard. Once he had the commander isolated, Ayanna would reveal herself. At the same time, Matan's warriors would spring from their hiding places, surrounding them, cutting off any escape or rescue. It was a long shot. A crazy, desperate gamble. It depended on the commander's arrogance, on Silas's ability to be a convincing liar, and on perfect split-second timing. "You would risk walking into their camp alone?" Matan asked, his eyes searching Silas's face. "It's a better chance than riding into their guns," Silas replied. Darkness fell, and the Apache warriors began their preparations. They were not preparing for a battle, but for a delicate, deadly surgical strike. Faces were painted not with the bold patterns of open war, but with the subtle symbols of the hunter, the stalker in the night. As Silas checked his own revolver, making sure every chamber was loaded, Matan came and stood beside him. The two men looked down at the twinkling lights of the enemy camp below. "If this fails," the chief said, his voice low, "if they take you, my warriors will attack at once. You will not die alone." "And if it succeeds?" Silas asked. Matan was silent for a moment. "If it succeeds," he said finally, "then you will have given my people something we thought was lost forever. Hope." He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. It was a gesture of trust, of alliance, of a strange and profound friendship born from crisis. Silas swung himself into the saddle. He took a small piece of a white shirt, tied it to the end of his rifle barrel, and took one last look at the painted warriors melting into the rocks around him. He looked at Ayanna, her face a pale oval in the moonlight, her eyes conveying a silent prayer. Then he spurred his horse forward and began the long, lonely ride down into the valley of death. The ride down the winding trail was the longest of Silas's life. Every rock looked like a soldier in ambush. Every gust of wind sounded like a shouted challenge. The campfires grew larger, the voices of the soldiers louder. He could smell their coffee, their horses, the casual confidence of an army that believes it holds all the cards. Two sentries stepped out from behind a rock outcropping, their rifles leveled at his chest. "That's far enough! State your business!" Silas raised the rifle with the white flag high. "Name's Silas Thornfield. I'm a rancher from the North Valley. I have information for your commanding officer. Urgent information." The sentries were suspicious. A lone rider in the middle of the night was not part of their routine. They disarmed him, taking his rifle and his Colt, and led him into the camp. The camp was a hub of activity. Soldiers cleaned rifles, played cards, and talked in low voices. They all stopped to stare as Silas was led through their midst. He felt 100 pairs of hostile eyes on him, and the back of his neck prickled. This was a mistake. This was a terrible, fatal mistake. He was brought to a large command tent in the center of the camp. A young, fresh-faced lieutenant emerged, his expression a mixture of curiosity and arrogance. "What's this about?" the lieutenant demanded. "I need to speak to your commander," Silas said, keeping his voice steady. "It's about the Peace Council. I have information that will be profitable for him." He used the word deliberately. Profitable. He was appealing to their greed. The lieutenant's eyes flickered with interest. He disappeared into the tent. A moment later a different man emerged. He was older, in his 40s, with cold, calculating blue eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. A major's insignia was pinned to his collar. This had to be him. "I am Major Thorne," the man said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "You have information for me." "I do, Major," Silas said. "But it's for your ears only. It concerns the precise location of Chief Matan and his warriors." Thorne's eyes narrowed. This was the bait. "Why would you, a simple rancher, betray the Apache to me?" he asked, his voice a silken threat. "Matan's warriors stole 20 head of my cattle last month," Silas lied, forcing anger into his voice. This isn't about patriotism, Major. It's about revenge and compensation. Thorne smiled, a cold, predatory expression. I see. Very well, Mr. Thornfield. Come inside. He gestured toward the tent. Silas's heart sank. The plan was to lure him out, not to go in. Inside the tent, surrounded by guards, he would have no chance. Actually, Major, Silas said, thinking fast, I'm not comfortable in enclosed spaces. And what I have to say? Well, walls have ears. There's a clearing just beyond the picket line. We can speak privately there. Thorne hesitated. His eyes darted around the camp, then back to Silas. The greed was warring with his paranoia. The promise of catching Matan, of being the hero who ended the Apache wars, was a powerful lure. Just you and me? Thorne asked. Just you and me, Silas confirmed, praying the Major's ego was as big as Ayanna had said. Very well, Thorne said after a long, tense moment. 2 of my men will escort us. They will stand 50 yards away, no closer. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. As they walked toward the edge of the camp, Silas could feel the eyes of Matan and his warriors on him from the darkness of the surrounding hills. The trap was about to be sprung. They reached a small moonlit clearing. Thorne's 2 guards took up positions at a distance, their rifles held ready. All right, Thornfield, Thorne said, turning to him. Talk. Silas took a breath. This was it. Matan isn't preparing for your peace council, Major. He's preparing for war. He knows. Knows what? Thorne asked, his voice sharp. He knows the peace council is a lie, Silas said, his voice dropping. He knows you plan to slaughter them all. His daughter, Ayanna, she overheard your plans. Thorne's face went rigid. The friendly mask dropped away, revealing the cold-blooded killer beneath. Where is she? He hissed. She's dead, Silas lied. Died of her wounds, but not before she told her father everything. A flicker of relief crossed Thorne's face. A pity, but it changes nothing. A dead girl's story against the word of a U.S. Army major? No one will believe him. He doesn't need them to believe him, Silas said. He's coming for you, Major, with every warrior he has. Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound. Let him come. My men will. You remember me, Major? The voice came from the shadows behind Thorne. It was soft, but it cut through the night air like a razor. Major Thorne spun around. Ayanna stepped out from behind a large boulder, her face illuminated by the moonlight. She was leaning on a warrior for support, but her eyes were blazing with a fire that was anything but weak. Thorne stared, his face a mask of pure shock and disbelief. You're supposed to be dead. I am harder to kill than you thought, Ayanna said, her voice dripping with contempt. And I am not the only one who knows of your treachery. As she spoke, the world around them came alive. From behind every rock, every bush, dark shapes rose. The silent, painted faces of 200 Apache warriors materialized out of the darkness, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. They had surrounded the clearing in absolute silence. Thorne and his 2 guards were hopelessly trapped. The Major's face went from shock to pure, cornered animal terror. His eyes darted around, seeing the impossible wall of warriors that had appeared from nowhere. His hand snatched for the pistol at his belt. "You'll never take me alive!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. But he never cleared the holster. An arrow, fired from the darkness, slammed into his wrist, pinning his hand to the leather of his own belt. He screamed in pain and shock. At the same moment, 2 warriors moved with liquid speed, disarming the stunned guards before they could even raise their rifles. It was over in 5 seconds. Checkmate. Chief Matan stepped into the clearing, his presence making the air crackle. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood face to face with the captured major. Thorne, clutching his wounded wrist, spat on the ground. "This changes nothing, you savage. Kill me, and the army will hunt you down and wipe every last one of you from the face of the earth." "We will not kill you, soldier," Matan said, his voice a low, cold growl. "Your death would be a mercy. You will be a messenger." Silas moved quickly to the Major's dispatch case, which had fallen to the ground during the struggle. He fumbled with the latch, opened it, and began shuffling through the papers inside. "He's right about one thing, Chief," Silas said, his eyes scanning the documents. Killing him won't stop this. He pulled out a folded piece of paper with an official seal. These are his written orders. They're not from a general. They're signed by the territorial governor himself. A stunned silence fell over the clearing. This wasn't just a rogue major's ambition. This was a conspiracy that went all the way to the top of the territorial government. They hadn't just captured a snake. They had uncovered a nest of them. "The other chiefs," Ayanna said, her voice urgent. "They are still riding to the meeting place. The soldiers there won't know Thorn has been captured. They will still follow their orders." A new, frantic urgency seized them. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. They were in a race against the sunrise. Matan issued a series of rapid commands. The war party would split. He would take the majority of the warriors and ride like the wind to intercept the other chiefs before they reached the ambush site. Silas and Ayanna, with a small escort of 10 elite warriors, would take a different, more dangerous path. They would take the prisoner, Major Thorn, and the governor's signed order, and they would ride for Fort Collins. It was a desperate gamble. They had to hope there was someone at the fort, an honorable officer, who would listen to an Apache princess and a renegade rancher, and who would dare to defy the governor himself. The two groups separated, melting back into the darkness. As Silas galloped through the night, with Ayanna at his side and the snarling, captured Major Thorn tied to a horse behind them, he knew the odds were impossibly long. They were riding toward the heart of their enemy's power, armed with nothing but the truth. It was a fool's errand. But as he looked at the fierce determination on Ayanna's face, silhouetted against the moon, he felt a flicker of the hope that Matan had spoken of. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were fighting for justice. And in the vast, unforgiving darkness of the American West, sometimes justice was the only light you had. The ride to Fort Collins was a brutal, relentless chase against the dawn. They pushed their horses to the limit. The 10 Apache warriors fanned out around them, silent scouts reading the terrain, avoiding patrols, their eyes and ears extending their senses for miles. Behind them, Major Thorn, gagged and bound, was a constant, seething presence. His eyes, visible over the gag, burned with a hateful promise of retribution. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, when they saw the fort. It was a formidable structure of wood and earth, the American flag hanging limp in the windless morning air. Getting inside would be the hardest part. A group of Apaches riding toward a U.S. Army fort with a white prisoner would look like one thing and one thing only: a war party. They stopped in a grove of cottonwoods a mile from the fort. "They will shoot us on sight," one of the warriors said, stating the obvious. Silas knew he was right. "I'll go alone," Silas declared. "You wait here. I'll ride in, tell them I've captured Thorn, that he's a traitor. I'll bring them back here." Ayanna shook her head. "No, they will not believe you. They will think it is a trick. We must show them the truth, all at once. It is the only way." Her courage was astonishing. She was proposing to ride into the jaws of the beast. Before Silas could argue, she turned to him. "Silas Thornfield, you saved my life. Now, you must trust my life in my hands." Their plan was desperate. Silas would ride ahead, holding the governor's order aloft like a flag of truce. Ayanna and the warriors would follow 50 yards behind, with Thorn. They would ride slowly, openly, making no sudden moves. They were counting on the shock of what the soldiers would see to buy them a few precious seconds before the shooting started. Silas galloped out of the trees, his heart hammering. He held the paper high, shouting, "Hold your fire! I have a prisoner, and urgent news for your commander." On the fort's walls, sentries raised their rifles. Shouts of alarm echoed across the parade ground. He could see the gunners on the ramparts swiveling a cannon in his direction. This was it. Then Ayanna and the warriors emerged from the trees. A collective gasp seemed to rise from the fort. The sight of a dozen Apache warriors, in full war paint, with a bound U.S. Army major, was so bizarre, so completely outside their experience, that it caused a moment of stunned confusion. That moment was all they needed. Silas reached the gates just as a stern, gray-bearded officer with a colonel's eagles on his shoulders stormed out, a dozen riflemen at his back. "What in the name of God is this?" the colonel roared. "Colonel Whitaker," Silas said, recognizing the fort's commander. a man known for his rigid adherence to the rulebook. "I have evidence of treason. This is Major Thorne." He was acting under direct orders from the governor to massacre the Apache chiefs at a false peace council. Whitaker stared from Silas to the bound Major Thorne, then to Ayanna, who now sat her horse with the regal bearing of a queen. "This is insane," Whitaker breathed. "Governor's orders?" Thorne, seeing his chance, began to struggle violently, his muffled shouts trying to form words. "Lies! It's a trap!" "Here are the orders, Colonel," Silas said, handing the paper to him. "Signed and sealed." Whitaker took the document, his eyes scanning it quickly. His face, already grim, darkened with every line he read. He looked up from the paper, his eyes filled with a cold, professional fury. He looked at Thorne, then at the governor's signature. He had served 20 years in the army, and he recognized the smell of a dirty political scheme when he saw one. "Cut him loose," Whitaker barked to his men, gesturing at Thorne, "and place him under arrest. Confine him to the stockade." As Thorne was dragged away, still screaming threats, a distant sound reached them. A volley of rifle fire from the east, from the direction of the supposed peace council. Ayanna's face went pale. "My father." At that moment, history split into two currents. At the fort, Colonel Whitaker, a man of honor, moved with decisive speed. He dispatched a company of cavalry to ride to the governor's residence and place him under house arrest. He sent another to ride to the peace council location, with orders to arrest the treacherous soldiers and prevent any bloodshed. But they were late. At the council grounds, Chief Mayton and his warriors had arrived only moments before the trap was sprung. He had managed to warn most of the chiefs, but the cavalry, realizing their plan was exposed, had opened fire. A chaotic battle had erupted. It was into this swirling melee of smoke and gunfire that Colonel Whitaker's cavalry thundered, their bugle calls cutting through the din. They charged not the Apaches, but the other U.S. soldiers, forcing them to surrender. The fighting stopped as quickly as it had begun. The conspiracy was broken. In the aftermath, a fragile, uncertain peace settled over the land. The governor was removed from office in disgrace, and Major Thorne was court-martialed. The story of the plot, and of the strange alliance that had stopped it, became a whispered legend in the territory. A few weeks later, Silas stood with Matan and Ayanna on the same ridge, where they had first spotted Thorne's camp. The valley below was peaceful now. "You have saved my people," Matan said, his voice heavy with a debt that could never truly be repaid. "You are no longer a stranger to us. You are a brother." Silas looked at Ayanna. In the chaos and the danger, something had grown between them. A respect, an understanding, a connection that transcended the boundaries of their two worlds. He was no longer the lonely man who had built walls to keep the world out. The world had come in, and he had found that he was stronger for it. Ayanna chose to stay, acting as an ambassador between her people and the fort, using her wisdom and courage to help build the lasting peace she had fought so hard for. Silas's ranch was no longer a fortress of solitude. It became a meeting place, a bridge between two cultures. His act of simple kindness, of helping a stranger by a creek, hadn't just saved her life. It had saved thousands. It had changed the course of history. The story of Silas and Ayanna proves that the choice of one person can change the world. It shows that compassion is stronger than hatred, and courage can bloom in the most unexpected places. If their story moved you, and if you believe that one small act of kindness can make a difference, then hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that remind us of the incredible power of the human spirit.